Hope everybody's doing well. I'm a little under the weather, so please forgive my energy level today. I think I'm usually a lot more lively. Um, but today I wanted to talk about emotional detachment or disassociation. So I'll be using both of those words kind of interchangeably because they kind of mean the same thing. Emotional disconnection or disassociation is a psychological defense mechanism, and it basically influences the way that we perceive and engage with the world. So I think a lot of us work out. So have we ever kind of like went through a workout and kind of like went in the zone where we don't really remember all the details of the workout, but we know we really hit it hard? Or maybe have driven home and don't really remember how you got yourself home. You know you got yourself home safe, but you were just kind of in such a disconnected state that you don't even really remember the details. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So we do it so often, a little bit unconsciously, that we don't even really think about it, but there is a word for it, and it is a thing that our brains go to and do, and it's a science behind it for sure. So anytime that we're disconnected from the reality of what's going on, so we're not really driving, we're kind of thinking about what happened at work or what's going to happen when we go home. That's when we know that we're disassociating in that moment. And it seems like it's kind of random and a little bit unconscious, but it's really like it's more conscious than that. It's when we perceive like a threat to our safety. So either like a real threat or a perceived threat to our emotional safety, our physical safety. That's usually when we start to disassociate and we start to disconnect. So this talk will primarily focus on how disconnection affects us individually as people, how it affects our community, so our personal relationships, our families, and then also how it affects the rest of the world that we occupy. So again, disassociation, I think we have some of the examples in it of how our mind kind of drifts off when we're not really in reality and the moment. That's an example of it. And it really comes up when we sense or perceive a threat that's coming up for us. Um, so, how does disassociation or detachment kind of affect us personally? So it affects us in a lot of ways, even though we kind of see it as maybe not as an important thing, or maybe even not a very conscious thing that we do. But one way that it affects us, as we just talked about it, is kind of our memory of a situation. So we can be driving home, right? And we don't really remember the details. We can be kind of, even if we hear like really big news for the day, sometimes people don't even remember what happened for the rest of the day. They're kind of like in a completely different state of mind, and just kind of like a little bit drifting through the day. So anytime that you can kind of like maybe watch yourself as you're going through the day and you feel like you're not in your current body or not in the reality of what's going on, that's probably when some disassociation has come up. So since we all have like some examples in mind and we know what it is right now, so I feel like we're all kind of like our own experts. I want to open up the chat right now so that we can like put in some examples of how maybe we're thinking of some examples of us disassociating or disconnecting, and one of which is like literally what I'm doing right now. It's pretty hard to like public speak. It's hard to speak to groups, and a lot of people will say that they feel very nervous in the beginning, and then like something takes over, right? And they just like kind of enter this zone, and maybe they don't remember all the details of what they said. Maybe they don't even say all the details that they want to say in the speech that they may have planned, but right, like kind of something takes over their mental space and they're able to kind of like do this very stressful thing that's pretty much very scary to them. um, they're probably kind of disassociated in the moment, so it's not always a negative thing. Sometimes it really helps us get through like super challenging things. But I'm really curious to kind of see some examples that are coming up for people as we're talking about it. I think
Chat's
it's
open.
Eva. Okay. It's open. I'm really curious because I think those are the ones that come to mind most immediately for me. Um, let's see what folks are saying. On the walks around the neighborhood. That's a good one. Commuting to work in the morning. Same for me. I feel like drives are a really good place for me to do a lot of thinking. Having a scary medical procedure. Yeah. For sure. Brush my teeth. Yeah, for sure. So it can be like something really normal, right? Like brushing your teeth, or something as scary as like a medical procedure. I think these are awesome examples.
So you're disconnecting from essentially one thing, but are you not? Are you just? So I've not heard of this before. So then, but are you connecting to? I guess your threat system goes up. You're disconnecting, but then you connect. I guess it's part of survival, isn't it? Maybe. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
talking out loud here. So maybe you're disconnecting, but actually, it's not like you're disconnecting and then becoming and walking into lampposts.
Right, exactly.
You're connected. You're leveling up to something else, aren't you? Or yeah.
Correct.
Let's try to keep comments within the chat and let Isasha lead us.
Yeah, we do have a Q&A period later. So yeah.
No worries.
No
I
worries,
appreciate that, Pete. Yeah. And I did make the talk a little shorter so that we could have more discussion time for sure, because I'm really curious to hear everyone's thoughts about this. But yeah, that's really common too. So we can do kind of our brains can do two things at once, right? Because how do we get ourselves home safely when we're driving if we're thinking about maybe what happened at work or maybe even something that's going to happen with our spouse in the future? So we're able to kind of get ourselves like places safely, and our brains are able to kind of like assess the immediate threats in our environment and know when we can disconnect, right? There are moments where it's kind of dangerous for us to disconnect, where we really need to be present, right? When we're having really important conversations with maybe our family members or ourselves. So there are times where we do need to be like fully aware of what's going on. And then there are times where maybe we don't. And I think our brains kind of like pick and choose those moments, kind of depending on where our nervous systems are and like the impact that stress is having on us in the moment. I just want to go back to the chat. Well, exercising, yeah, for sure, all the time. ADD, for sure, for sure. That can be super helpful to ground yourself. And when a colleague comes into the office to talk my ear off, for sure, I think I can, for sure, and a lot of us can see in meetings with people that a lot of our coworkers can disconnect as well, and not necessarily be there. These are really great examples. It's also like a feeling of like almost sometimes body doubling, right? So you have like this one version of yourself that's like fully conscious and aware, and that's like aware of what you're doing because you have to keep yourself safe in the moment. And then there's like another version of yourself that's like maybe problem solving something that's really stressful to you, maybe anticipating an event that you and like need to work out in your head, and they're happening simultaneously in the moment, but you're not completely in the reality and grounded and rooted kind of in what's going on if you're thinking about kind of all of these things and you're kind of disassociating. Um, Another way that it comes up for us is not feeling physical sensations. So maybe going through a really like stressful work day or a work day that a lot of things are coming up and not remembering to eat lunch or not even remembering that you're hungry, forgetting that you need to use the bathroom until you actually have a moment to sit down and ground yourself. And then you're like, oh man, I really got to use the bathroom. Um, right, not feeling thirsty, kind of overworking yourself too. So having a super long list of to-dos and just kind of getting through them and not realizing that, wow, I've done maybe like 20 things for the day. Like this is a lot of tasks, right? So sometimes like that activation mode kind of like it impacts our ability to be self-aware in the moment because you're really just kind of like going and your mind is in a different space. Um, so I also wanted to talk about the effects of disassociation on like kind of communities, right? So our personal relationships, our spouses, is we're not just engaging with ourselves throughout the day, right? We're around people constantly. So what does that look like when we're kind of like a little bit checked out, but like present a little bit, right? So we're body doubling. So we have this version of ourselves that can kind of engage with people to an extent, right? Because there's still kind of the memory loss. So you may not remember the details of what people are saying or the essence kind of what they're saying, but you know how to respond in the moment and kind of like get through whatever's going on. Um, and hang on, I just got a little lost. Another way that this comes up, and it may be a little bit surprising to hear, but another form of this is having a defense mechanism. So oftentimes when we disassociate from reality, we're detaching from something that's unpleasant, right? That's why we're kind of going to another space. It's an unpleasant feeling or memory or thing that we're trying to get away from, maybe even a trauma. And being defensive is a way to kind of protect that unpleasantness that you're trying to go to. So have you ever tried to like get someone to see your point that's really rooted in reality? You have your points, you have all of the evidence to back up and support what you're saying. And nevertheless, they double down on their point and kind of like dig their heels into the sand. It's because they're protecting themselves from being hurt in that moment. And that's just a really different way than we're taught to look at defensiveness, right? In general, we're taught to kind of like combat that and kind of like double down too, and kind of like bring up more supportive evidence, right? And keep trying to convince this person that you're correct and that you have a point, when the ability for that person to see your point may be rooted in their ability to feel safe. And maybe what you're suggesting actually like threatens their sense of safety that they've built up and created for themselves. So I think it's like a really different way than we're taught to kind of respond to defensiveness, because it's really unpleasant in the moment, right? Like somebody kind of comes off as an asshole. You're trying to talk to them. You may be even trying to tell them something that's helpful for them in the moment. They may even be asking for your help. And then when you try to like bring up things, they actually get defensive in response to it. And it can be really confusing, like what's happening for that person in the moment. But in the moment, they're really trying to protect themselves from emotional pain and trauma. And the answer is not to kind of double down and provide more evidence or more details to kind of convince them to see your perspective or your point. It's better to help them kind of like root themselves or ground themselves in the moment, or maybe even disengage so that you can give them a chance to kind of like reassess and kind of like ground themselves and with themselves. Like sometimes people need to do it alone. So it sometimes kind of like is a observation from the person that's not in that defensive state. And just to give another example to kind of take it out of context, think of it as because when you perceive a threat to your actual sense of safety, it doesn't matter like whether it's a real threat or like a actual threat of safety. It just matters how your actual like nervous system and how you're perceiving it. So think about if we were like in the wilderness and you were with a friend and you actually got hurt. Let's say you broke a leg or you broke an arm, and you were really scared and frightened about your ability to like get back to safe ground, right? To your ability to get yourself back to safety. And you're telling your friend about your fears, and they start kind of giving you a bunch of positive affirmations. Think about how frightening that might be and how it might not help you feel very supported in that moment. You might just double down on your fear, right? And just try to convince this person, like, no, this is a real, actual fear. So I think that's how a lot of people in the moment feel when they're getting defensive. It's like, this is a real fear for me, and I actually need to really protect this assertion that I have, or this idea, or this these opinions, because if it breaks right now, like my ability to keep myself safe, my ability to ground myself is going to be imploded. So it's really important for me not to be pushed in that way. And it's really important not to give people like kind of more affirmations, more evidence, more convincing in that moment. It's only going to make them double down as well. And the answer to being disassociated is not kind of more positivity of like, how can we look at all the things that's going great in our lives? It's really just being present with yourself and present with those emotions and those feelings. So helping someone actually get back to presence is probably the most helpful for them in the moment. So if someone's experiencing fear, just kind of like confirming that and saying like, maybe this is scary, right? It's really scary to change our thoughts and ideas about the world around us. Like I totally understand that. And maybe just kind of leaving it alone and disengaging and allowing that person to kind of come around mentally to what you're saying. We all have kind of confirmation bias where we're looking to be right. So I think in a lot of moments, kind of doubling down and trying to dig your heels in the sand, it doesn't help the situation. And we kind of forget that there's a lot of mental processes that are going on when we're engaging with one another. So I think a way to be a little bit more empathetic, and it's hard to be empathetic to people that are defensive, but it's to kind of reframe what they're doing in the moment of this is a way that they're protecting themselves, and I'm not perceiving a threat to my safety, so I don't actually need to be right or to be confirmed right now. This person actually has a higher stake, right, in this conversation or engagement. And yeah, so I wanted to ask a question and open up the chat again to folks and ask, as I was talking, did anybody think of some examples of when they were defensive, and maybe how that came up for you, maybe even why that came up for you in the moment now that you're not in that state of mind? And if we feel comfortable to maybe give some examples of that. And I'm going to go to the chat, see what folks are saying. Arguing with dad about politics, for sure. Yeah, it's hardest when we both feel like our identities are being threatened, right? For sure. But a really good way to reframe it is that this is kind of like a conflict of identities and less about the actual like politics that we're talking about. Okay. Sometimes it's really not about the argument, for sure. For sure. I think for myself, I can get very, very defensive. I never learned how to drive until maybe up until a year ago. I'm a native New Yorker and thought that I would never need to learn how to drive. And then suddenly I was learning how to drive by people that had been driving since they were teenagers. And it feels really uncomfortable to be an apprentice, right? And to be a person who's not an expert at something and it has to be taught every little kind of detail. And I remember getting very defensive with people when they would correct me or the ways that they would correct me. And I literally didn't know what I was doing, right? Like I'm driving and I need to keep us safe. But in the moment, it was so important for me not to feel inadequate, not to feel like I didn't know what I was doing, not to feel uncomfortable, right? And the right, being corrected by people that are my peers that have been doing this thing that I don't know how to do was so uncomfortable for me. So I remember my tone changing, the words that I use. I was unpleasant for sure. And I'm asking for people's help. So that's what I mean. Sometimes we can ask for people's help and forget how it feels to actually be helped and like what actually comes up for us in the moment. It's so easy for us to kind of fall into that defensiveness when we're trying to protect ourselves. I'm going to go to the chat. I'm curious to see anybody else's like examples. But okay. For sure. For sure. A sign that I need to rethink later. And the other person is challenging for me. Yes, for sure. And it's a way, I mean, that's a really great way to reframe it, is to think of when we start to get defensive, that something's being threatened here, that something else is going on that we are not able to kind of see in the moment. And maybe it's best for us to disengage so that we can connect back to ourselves and figure out, what is it that's going on? Why is this coming up for me? Is it the words that someone's using? Is it the phrases? Is it how they're saying it? Like, is it something that's like unresolved for me in the moment? But like, what is it that's causing this reaction or response? Because it's something that's causing it, for sure. Thank you guys for adding these examples. I know it's not easy to kind of talk about when we show up and we're less pleasant than we want to be, all right? Like less great moments for us, but it's a natural like response to protect us. So if we just kind of reframe it for ourselves and it's a little bit less shameful for us, then we'll have less shame for other people. It'll be a little bit easier to deal with and a lot easier not to just kind of shoo away like, oh, this person is so hard to deal with, right? And it's just so easy not to engage with them because we've also kind of been there as well ourselves. And the last portion is, how does disassociation and emotional disconnection affect the broader society and the world around us, right? So it's one thing to like detach emotionally or disassociate when it's with us, when we're by ourselves, when we're driving, when we're working out, and also when we're engaging with family, friends, or even coworkers. Maybe we've developed a way to do it where it doesn't necessarily cause us any like negative effects, right? We've probably developed this in childhood, kind of disconnecting, especially if you've grown up in a chaotic environment. You've probably gotten really good at disconnecting and disassociating what's happening in your actual environment, and kind of really going into your head. And I see a lot of people nodding, so I'm sure that we're already thinking of, like, you know, some of these things that led to these coping mechanisms. But what happens when we think about them in some of our shared spaces or in, like, kind of systemic inequalities? So all of us here are logging into this meeting using some form of technology, and that includes like conflict materials from the DRC, which we all know is perpetuating human slavery. So there's some sort of like disassociation that's needed in order for us to just kind of exist in the world, right? Without kind of being under chronic stress. Like, we have to kind of become a little bit desensitized to some of the inequalities that's happening, or sometimes normalizing some of the systems that exploit labor, right? And kind of the supply chain that kind of impacts it. So I want to kind of end on a question where I ask us kind of like, how do we make sense of that kind of mental disconnection and disassociation when it comes to the greater world? And I just wanted to give some more like examples of that. So acknowledging some of the domestic inequalities that's going on while sometimes ignoring like marginalized communities globally is an example of kind of how it affects our greater world. Sometimes recognizing or viewing racial disparities that happen in education and employment and criminal justice as isolated incidents that you can kind of like look at individualized instead of like an interconnected systemic issue is a way to kind of like disconnect from how stressful this actually could be, right? If I just look at this one situation that's on the news, I don't have to think about this as a systemic issue that I really have no power to do anything about. And that might cause me more stress. So this might be kind of like an easily digestible way for my nervous system to take in this reality. Um, Also, maybe prioritizing like national interests without considering the impact that US policies have on global communities, such as through like military interventions or even trade policies. And we can kind of like look over here and not look over there. It's kind of like a little bit more digestible. And if we've been doing that with ourselves as a practice, then it makes it a lot easier to do it with others and to do it with the rest of the world. If I spend most of my time disconnected from the uncomfortable things that's associated with my own life, then it's a lot easier to disconnect than what's happening with other people's lives that's in my community that I see every day, and a lot more easier to disconnect with people that I don't have to see that are living in the world, right? Where things that I do may impact them, right? Like, it's so much easier to say like, hey, I'm just buying a cup of coffee. How is this contributing to a war or a genocide, right? Like, I can disconnect from how my personal choices impact the greater world around me, literally for survival. And I'm really curious to know like what folks' thoughts are. So I am going to stop the chat here and just kind of like open up the discussion a little bit sooner to like hear what you guys are thinking or how you guys make sense of this too, because we can't be in a state of chronic stress all the time. That's not healthy for us. And I think we all talked about how some of this like disconnection is helpful for a lot of the stressful things that we end up going through. So I wonder if there's like a balance to kind of like I guess living in reality and then disconnecting from reality as well, and maybe doing it a little bit more intentionally. So I'm really curious to hear what you guys think and what you guys' thoughts are of the talk. Thank you so much for coming and listening.